So this is another video from the old channel days of If Flix Could Talk. Again, I really liked making these videos, and when I started that channel back in 2020, it was right at like the peak of Halloween. So I have a lot that are based around horror movies. This is the second one I'm re-uploading. I might do one or two more. One of them I'm not too sure about, but the other one might definitely come up in the next week or so, so keep your eyes open for that one. Otherwise, once again, this is kind of about movies that were out at that point in time, so some things might have changed, specifically based on the movies that might have come after the fact, but I still stand by what I say about these sequels. Either way, hope you enjoy it. Some movies have never been given a sequel, though some may deserve it, and that's okay if they don't get one. Some stories are better left to be told only once, and a sequel just isn't necessary. The horror film genre is definitely riddled with its fair share of unnecessary sequels, but more often than none, they do work in favor of their predecessors. But sometimes, not so much. With that thought, I decided to put together 13 bad horror movie sequels. Now I put this list together following 3 basic rules. Rule number 1, of course, there are no year restrictions, there are no subgenre restrictions, except of course, no comedy horror. Rule number 2, I tried to go with films that only have 1 or 2 sequels. I didn't want to talk about franchises in this video or anything of that sort, so I do keep it to films with only a sequel, or perhaps part of a trilogy, and either the second or third attempts were all fails. Rule number 3, for a couple of films, I had to go against my own overall outlook for what I want my videos to portray, which is that I only like to mention certain films once, to leave room for other films to be discussed. Though this isn't 100% against that rule, I have mentioned some of the film's predecessors in other videos. Me mentioning the sequels now is technically an endorsement for the first part, and in those videos I also mentioned how the sequels to those films weren't as good, but I didn't go fully into how I felt about them when discussing the first part, and that's what I'm going to do here. Also, let's not forget, this is just my opinion, though the majority of these films do have critical reviews that prove their downfall. For this video, I'm going to try to steer away from showing those reviews, because for some of them, even the first parts aren't reviewed that great. Maybe you agree with my choices, maybe you don't. Whichever it is, leave a comment below with your thoughts and maybe we can discuss it further. Let's start the list off with Jeepers Creepers 3 from 2017. I remember how random this film was when it first came out. It is definitely a film known in the horror community, and it gets its praise for being a unique story. The first one was released in 2001. There was a sequel released in 2003, and those two films tell a good story, even though there is very little connection between them. This third installment doesn't come out for another 14 years, and it's completely lost the aesthetic the first two films held together. The quality is diminished to the point where it doesn't even resemble the foundations of the first two films. I watched it and was so angry about what they did. Now, neither of these films are going to win any awards, but this was definitely where they fell off in the series, and hopefully they leave it here and don't ruin it any further. Next up, Sinister 2 from 2015. This film has a pretty cool concept. A demon that lives in pictures and film reels brainwashes your children to murder you. We all see the concept of the demon caught in the picture when it gets taken in your living room or something, but that picture is usually showing the demon in your environment. The demon doesn't actually live in the picture. This demon does, though. The first one has a very creepy vibe. I enjoyed it very much, and I thought it would have been fine as a standalone story. There is an opening to make more, since it isn't restricted to anything. Just the fact that the picture the demon infests has to be found, but the second one just didn't live up to that. It did the typical horror movie cash grab, throw in as many jump scares, the script doesn't matter, and then let's overplay everything the demon can do, which we didn't do in the first film. This second part is missing a lot of the aesthetic that the first one created, and the continuity is so weird, but who's paying attention really? Yeah, I was, and I was upset. Next up, Grave Encounters 2 from 2012. Coming out only a year after the first film, and I've said it before, this is one of my favorite found footage style films ever. And this is the best example I can give about how sometimes a sequel is just ruined by overdoing what was already done. What's sad is, it starts off great. It follows a similar path of the first one, kind of going into the behind the scenes formula of, well, people like me, movie reviewers. It starts off with a bunch of people who are movie reviewers discussing the first film. It sort of breaks the fourth wall in its own universe, I guess you could say. And again, that's a pretty cool starting point. But of course, it falls short the further into the film it goes. It just goes really overboard and sort of overuses a lot of what the first one did, almost like a carbon copy. And I hate it when they do that for sequels. I just wish they left the first one alone, because it was so good, and this one just isn't. Next up, The Hills Have Eyes from 2007. Now, I'm strictly talking about the sequel to the rebooted version of these films. The reboot was released in 2006. The original film came out in 1977, followed by a sequel to that film in 1985. The first two were written and directed by Wes Craven. Now, that is one of the biggest names in horror. And he had very little to do with the reboot from 2006, only being credited as a producer. The director and co-writer was Alexander Aja, who did a fantastic job with the reboot. This is the same director who gave us films like Mirrors, P2, the Maniac reboot, and as recently as Crawl from 2019. He also gave us Piranha 3D, but you can't win them all. Either way, this reboot was such a shining light on what a redemption and bittersweet revenge story could turn out to be. It was so good! Now, I don't know if it has any real connection with the original films from the 70s and the 80s, but in my opinion, that reboot is definitely the better of all four films. However, even when Wes Craven came back into the writing chair, this 2007 sequel was a mess. First off, the director for the original reboot was nowhere to be found. Instead of being about redemption or even about a family, it dove further into the experimentation of the people in the hills, and it mostly followed a group of soldiers. It's almost its own standalone story that has no connection with what the first film gave us. Maybe if it was its own standalone story, it might have done better, but because it's a sequel that completely derails the formula of its predecessor, it's not worth going through. Next up, Rings from 2017. This is the third installment of the film series that is part of the Americanized versions. The first Ring was released in 2003. The sequel, The Ring 2, was released in 2005. This third part is released 12 years later. The biggest issue is that it isn't a bad concept to the Ring universe. It actually makes sense. It's just executed so poorly that it doesn't do itself justice. And that's the biggest shame of them all. Next up, Halloween 2 from 2009, and I'm talking about the sequel of the Rob Zombie reboot of the series. His take on the first film, in my opinion, was top-notch, going deeper into the psychology of Michael Myers. However, I don't even think he wanted to do the sequel. He said while on the Joe Rogan podcast that filming was so chaotic since he had the reins of a huge franchise, the studio was only about making money. They meddled with his production so much, he felt it ruined his process. And it definitely shows. This one does not live up to the first take, and it's definitely just a cash grab, which is something, if you follow him, Rob Zombie isn't known to do. Right after that, 30 Days of Night, Dark Days from 2010. Based on a comic series with the same name, the first film was amazing. I can watch that one over and over again. There's a specific scene at the very beginning when the vampires first attack the town, and there's an overhead helicopter shot that just shows all the destruction and bloodshed scattered all over the snow. It's a very visual scene, and it's a very well done film. It's set in the background of a 30-day blackout that happens in Alaska, which is a real thing. And what a great concept. Vampires attacking a town that doesn't get sunlight for a certain period of time at all? That's a recipe for win if I've ever seen one. Now, they made a sequel, and I can't say a single positive thing about it. It drives so far away from the source material. Sure, if you want to say it's just an interpretation, but it's not a good one. It's done so poorly and falls flat all the way through. It's really disappointing. Following that one up with Creep 2 from 2017. I mentioned the first Creep in another video, and I thoroughly believe it's a good film, at least for one sit-through. It does have a pretty decent concept to offer, but a sequel? I mean, without giving too much away of the ending to the first film, yeah, I could see the opening for more films in this kind of universe, but this is not what I was looking for. It's basically what happens when you tell someone, yeah, you can copy my homework, just change it up a little. And then they do something like change the main character's name from Brian to Ryan. It's just a missed opportunity, and it doesn't live up to what it could have possibly been. Next up, The Last Exorcism Part 2 from 2013. If you don't know the first film, The Last Exorcism from 2010, this film picks up, I believe, directly after the events of that film. And if you have seen or heard of the first one, you can tell right off the bat the one huge difference. The first film is done in a found footage style. The second isn't. It's just a regular film. In fact, the only thing the two films have in common is that it follows the character of the young girl who is the center of the exorcism in the first one. And it's... well, Bill?
That just makes no fucking sense. I mean, it's just bullshit. Fuck. Oh my.
Seriously though, this was a poor excuse for a sequel. Coming up right after that, VHS Viral from 2014. This is the third part of the VHS trilogy. There is no real connection the films share, except that they follow the same formula. Weird stories that are told across VHS tapes that are played by people who have a separate story in the background. It's usually 4 or 5 stories, and those people in the background have a completely different story happening in between each other story, and then at the end it kind of comes to a climax. That's basically how the films are formatted. This third went a bit more above and beyond with the story in the background, and it took the term viral and rolled with it so much that it becomes annoying after a while. Being that I love and will always praise the first 2 films in the trilogy, this does not live up to those 2 in any way, shape, or form. It's upsetting because it's a great idea that could probably keep going, but this is not the direction to take it in. Coming up next, Contracted Phase 2 from 2015, and goddammit, when I spoke about how good the first film was, I truly believe that it is one of the best and most unexpected films I had ever seen in regards to what it's trying to portray. And without ruining the first one in case you haven't seen it yet, which is going to be hard to try to explain the second act, but either way, I do believe that the second part has totally stopped the hope of further films being made. Phase 2 picks up soon after the events of the first film, but the issue is that it's a completely different movie. Sure, you can argue that this is the most rational way to go for how the first film ends, but you could also make an argument that you maybe just don't make a sequel! The first one could have been left alone. No one would have been mad about it. But no, they want to make money. It doesn't matter if you destroy the story or if you destroy the quality of what the first movie had to bring. This is a perfect example of how some films do not need a sequel. Next up, The Strangers Pray at Night from 2018. Let's just do a quick rundown, shall we? Not only is it done 10 years after the first film was released, not only is it a completely different director, not only is it released by a completely different production company, it also has a completely different list of producers. And it's not even in the same ballpark as the first film, which is an amazing film if I might add. The first film had a sort of sadistic take on being alone and unaware of your surroundings. It's the kind of unsettling midnight horror flick that makes you want to lock your doors. The sequel is like someone trying to cosplay the first film, but really they're just a couple of Harley Quinn wannabes and a dude who wishes he was Kane from the WWE. It's an embarrassment to the first film, and it definitely shows the lack of understanding in what an audience wants in a sequel. And last but not least, American Psycho 2, An American Girl from 2002. Unfortunately, I have to make a confession. I have not actually sat through this hot garbage. I just know it exists. Here's the biggest issue. American Psycho is a film from 2000. That film is based on a novel by Bret Ellis. You might know that film as being one of Christian Bale's greatest films ever. Well, this sequel, from what I've read, has literally nothing to do with the novel, and it has very little to do with Bale's character at all. That's 2 big red flags. And here's the third one. Apparently, the script was originally meant to be a standalone film, and someone decided to attach it to American Psycho? How did they do that? Well, here's a quick synopsis of the opening scene. It starts with a 12-year-old girl whose babysitter is on a date with serial killer Patrick Bateman. After Bateman kills and starts to dissect her babysitter, the girl stabs him with an ice pick. What? That's how you kill off the main character of such a tremendous film, you just literally destroyed the image of the entire first movie. And you did that just so you could attach the name of the film to this dumpster fire? What asshole had this smart idea? I feel bad for no one after this movie was an obvious flop. And what's weirder, the two main actors are Mila Kunis and William Shatner. What? I have nothing else to say, and I will never watch this film. Well, guys, there you have it. That's 13 really bad horror movie sequels. If you agree or disagree with my choices, if you have some other bad movie sequels you want to throw in there, leave those all down in the comments, and we can discuss them further. If you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. I upload a new video every Friday, every week. The only way to see them is, of course, a subscription. I appreciate all of you for watching. Thank you so much. The support means so much to me. You guys are the greatest. My name is Jesse, and if Flix could talk, here's what they would say.